Empathy. That is the topic of conversation here today with my guest, Erin Thorp. She's a keynote speaker, writer, coach for leaders who struggle with conflict, communication, and performance during high-stress times. Sounds like leaders in construction. Nice thing about Erin, though, is she has many, many years actually working in construction in all sides and facets of the business. So she knows what she's talking about. Now, listen, this is a killer conversation, and I think it's part one of more conversations with Erin, because we get into stuff that's kind of subtle and very difficult to tease out in one conversation. And so what I'd like you to do is just listen for the first couple of minutes as Erin defines what she means by empathy. And then she'll give some background as far as her own career is concerned. And that'll help you to get some context as far as her construction bona fides. And then we're going to get into things like how to be a good active listener, the challenges that men and women have working together in construction as it regards to processing emotions. Men throw chairs, women cry, generally speaking. And I think this conversation is really, really good. And what it's going to do for you, it's going to spark thinking for your daily interactions with people in your organization, whether men or women. And that spark is going to be very important for you to lay hold of and consider how you can build better relationships with the people that you lead. And being a leader is a tremendously challenging responsibility because of the difficulties we have managing different personalities and different people and having to learn how to do that effectively. And really, that's what this conversation is all about. So enjoy it. We're going to come back to Erin probably by the end of this year. We're recording this in 2023. So we'll have another episode later on in this year or maybe early 24. So make sure that you catch that one as well. All I can say is just listen to the conversation. You'll enjoy it. It'll be beneficial to you. It'll be useful. Thank you for listening to Construction Genius here today. This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. Erin, welcome to Construction Genius.
Thanks for having me, Eric. It's great to meet you today.
You have 20 years of experience in construction, and in that time, you've done a lot of thinking around the idea of empathy. And I'd like to just kick it off by asking you, what do you mean by empathy?
Yeah, for sure. I like how you phrase that. You've had a lot of time to think about it. So for me, empathy is simply the ability to understand and accept other people's perspective, opinions, and feelings, or emotions, whichever word strikes you. But it's really that understanding and acceptance piece is what comes up when I talk about empathy in the work that I do.
Let me ask, what do you mean by acceptance?
Yeah, it's good. So I think it's just simply being able to acknowledge that what somebody has shared with us is true for them. So it's not necessarily, there's a difference for me between acceptance and agreement. Okay. Acceptance to me means that I can take this thing that you've just shared, your perspective, your opinion, and I can hold space for it, and I can allow it to be true for you without trying to change it. But it also doesn't mean that I necessarily have to agree or endorse what your position is. It can simply just be true for you.
So if I disagree with it in the context of work, if I disagree with, so to speak, your truth, as you said, let's say you're a customer of mine or a subcontractor of mine, an employee of mine, and there's a circumstance where I need to try and change it, or it's appropriate to change that perspective. How do I handle that then?
Well, and I think it's a great question. And I think that's what we often see and why we have these very tense and, tough conversations throughout any kind of construction project, whether it's in the beginnings or the ends, because there's often a difference of opinion. There's often a difference of priorities. There's often a difference of how we see these things coming together. And the role I think empathy plays in that is just for a minute, when we come at the conversation, there's my way and there's your way, and obviously right off the bat, we've identified, we see this problem very differently. Yes. Where I think empathy can play a role is in each one of us. And usually it just takes one person to make the shift. But just for a minute, even if you can allow yourself for a couple of minutes to just explore what's going on for the other side. Why might they have the opinion they have? Why might they be feeling like they've been feeling? A very classic example is I spent 20 years as a general contractor. Subtrades have some very specific thoughts about general contractors, right? And some of them are not always so pleasant because of the way they've been treated in the past. So when I would come up against a subtrade in a contract negotiation that was very rooted into, their perspective, their opinion, how they thought this needed to go, what I found to be most effective is just to explore that with them. Like, why is that true for you? How is it that you've come to that decision or that perspective? Why are you feeling the way that you're feeling? And it's very interesting when you stop for just a few seconds and really get curious about what's going on for the other person. You can almost see the shoulders drop, and they're like, oh, you actually care about what's going on for me. And what I've come to really learn and understand, and I mean, it helped on the construction site, but it's really helping right now in life, just raising children, is when you can take a minute and just put your perspective aside and get into the perspective of somebody else's, you can learn a lot, and you now have the information that you need to help them navigate to the destination that you want to take them to.
Okay. Give us a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, so I have a degree in civil engineering and went right into construction, actually as part of my internship program. During my degree program, I spent 18 months on a construction site and was fortunate enough to actually do the design, the development, the build, and the turnover in that 18 months. And I think it got me hooked. I loved the process. I loved seeing this thing that I had a hand in building. I loved the experience of working with all of the tradespeople. I loved the experience of, moving people into their new space, going back year after year. And so when I graduated, I went right back into construction, where I spent 5 years until our first child was born. And then the construction lifestyle is not well suited still to this day for young parents. It's very difficult just because of how we have structured the industry, which I think is changing. But definitely 20 years ago, it was not conducive to having young children at home. So I actually went to the supplier side and I worked, I still stayed in construction, but I worked for a construction materials and supply company as a field engineer, and then as a project manager, and then as a director of engineering for them. And, it was a global firm. So I was doing lots of travel. I had, as my career progressed with them, so did the travel, so did the responsibilities. And at that point I had 3 kids. They were school-aged kids, and life was getting pretty busy at home. So the travel just wasn't working for me anymore. So I took a position at an owner's company. So then I went to the owner side of construction and worked in, on the owner side for a large oil and gas project here in Alberta. So I spent 5 years delivering that project. So, different seat in the project makeup. Yep. So I was on the owner side, hiring trades, really seeing that side of things. And then I went back to commercial construction on the general contractor side around 2017, and I stayed there till the pandemic. And then when the pandemic hit, was really kind of my opportunity to start doing what I'm doing now. And currently I work with engineering and construction teams, building empathy skills, teaching them how to have these tough conversations, and just really trying to equip them with the skills that I think are necessary to navigate leadership in construction as the landscape changes, because we have a labor shortage. We have people that are demanding new things, different things. We're trying to increase women, increase the minority population in construction, and we need to access these demographics to be able to have a labor pool. But our current leadership approach does not allow them to succeed.
Okay, tell me about that.
And
What do you mean by our current leadership approach does not allow them? And I'm assuming by them you mean minorities and women. Is that correct?
yes.
Okay, so why doesn't our current leadership approach allow them to succeed?
I think for starters, we just have so many more options right now that the employee has choice. And when you think about traditional leadership models in the construction world specifically, it was a very authoritarian, very almost command and control, like this is what needs to be done, let's go do it. And there was no room for this like human element of I have an emotion, or I have feelings, or I have competing priorities. So I'll just use my own experience. When I first joined the construction world, 90% of my leaders were men who had wives that stayed at home and raised the kids. So already they approached me like they approached their own experience, right? So I was held to the same expectations that they had themselves to. However, I had a very different experience at home.
What do you mean by what you just said there? Tell me what you said. They held you to. What do you mean by that?
So, for instance, they could come in at 5:30 in the morning if there was a concrete pour and stay till 10 p.m. because somebody had life at home under control, right? I did not have that luxury. We are a 2-income family. My husband worked as well and has a career. Our kids were at daycare. They needed to be picked up and dropped off. And there were certain times that needed to happen. And it didn't mean I was any less committed to the work. It just meant I have other things going on in my life outside of 12 hours on a construction site.
So let me ask you this. I live in California, right? In the summers, it gets into the hundreds here. We have to have early morning pours.
Yes.
Right? It's just the reality of the business. And so
it is.
Some of the pushback that I think on the one hand, the idea of, changing the command and control aspects of construction, which, there's a logic behind it, but they may have negative impacts. I understand where you're coming from there, but then, we have a schedule, we have a client, we got to get stuff done. And because of the weather, we're going to have this pour at 4:30, 5:30, even earlier in the morning, simply because if we don't, then we're not going to be able to get it done.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
What do you say to in that situation as you're describing your circumstance? I get that, but then there are the realities of the business.
Absolutely. And I live in Canada, so we have minus 45 days where, we have exactly the same thing. It's like, oh my gosh, okay, it's getting up to minus 20 today. We have to do this thing today. So I get that there are these circumstances and circumstances of the business that dictate when things get done. What I'm suggesting is the command and control style of leadership that does not allow for the conversation about what might I need, or how could I, what are some possibilities for me to participate in this industry, but also allow me to raise a family, or to, it could be children, it could be aging parents. There could be a whole bunch of things that, everyone's situation is different. It's when we make the assumption that everybody is having our experience. So again, if I go back to my leaders' experience, their assumption and how they approached leading me was, well, you should just be able to do what I do, right? Like, why don't get someone to look after your children? Well, I have someone, except that someone is me sometimes, and so this is where the conversation, I think, is so important. And the skill of empathy becomes so important, because if someone would have just said, we have to have a concrete pour at 5 a.m. Can you make that happen? But what do we have to do to support you to make that happen?
So let me ask you about that. So, because you are giving the practical example, and I do think it's very important to think about it. What should I do in that situation if I'm the owner of a construction company and I have a project manager like yourself who has responsibilities outside of work? and I have this concrete pour. Well, how should I handle that?
Yeah. So to me, it's about the conversation. Like, what do you need to make this happen? You know. So for me, you know, that would have looked like, I can be there at 5 a.m., but I'm going to need to be gone by 3, because that means that somebody's going to have to pick up the kids, right? I can ask my husband to shift
Sure.
or get somebody to look after that. Or even if it's a one-off, you know, like, okay, so today's the day you need me for 12 hours, but it's not an expectation that goes on for weeks and weeks and months and years, that Erin is available from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m., right? And I think that's where we get ourselves into trouble as leaders, is we don't have the conversation about how can we support you to meet the project goals, but also meet the priorities in your life.
Yep.
What needs to happen there? And having been in the seat, you know, the last few years of my career, I was in that leadership seat having these conversations. What I learned is really this is very minimal. What the employees ask of the company is very minimal. You know, it's literally just about being flexible with some work arrangements and maybe getting a little bit creative about how we stagger shifts, or, you know, where people end and pick up, and, you know, how we piece out scopes of work to different people on the project. You know, it requires a bit of creativity, but it doesn't require a ton of resources and a ton of money and a ton of all of these things. It's your time that you invest in the conversation and the ability to get creative and think outside the box. That, sure, it might be something different that we've never done before, but it doesn't mean it can't work.
Yeah. So that's interesting. You say it's very minimal, because what I'm hearing there is that, so let's say I have a certain perspective that, you know, we're doing the concrete pour and we're going to be here from, you know, 5:30 or 4:30 all the way till whenever we're done. And that's just my frame of reference. So when someone comes in with a request that is outside of that frame of reference, I have a difficult time processing it. But what's interesting to me is that and I'm talking about from a company owner's perspective here. So for instance, I have 5 kids, right? And my wife, she runs the house, so she doesn't have an outside job.
Yep.
And when we had our kids, I took 0 time off, like 0. I mean, like maybe 2 days, 3 days, you know what I'm saying? But now let's say I'm running a construction company, and I'm mandated by the government to give someone 3 months off, like a dude, 3 months off, you know, to have a kid.
Yeah.
And so to me, that doesn't sound very minimal. And so we have all of these sort of competing, we have these pressures on construction companies. And I understand where you're coming from with the labor shortage. I understand. I mean, I get where you're coming from there. And yet a lot of construction company owners are just frustrated because they have all of these burdens upon them. And at the same time, I've signed a contract, and construction's tremendously risky. And not only have I signed the contract, but I've put my house on the line.
Right.
I've personally guaranteed this. And then I have my employees coming to me asking for all of these things that at times, I agree with you, Erin, are minimal, but really they're not in some situations.
In some cases, they're not. Yep.
How am I supposed to handle all of that?
Yeah. And I think this is where, the skill of empathy can really benefit us, because I always say, you know, those of us in the construction world, we're kind of paid professional problem solvers. That's what we're paid to do, right? Manage risk, solve problems. And we get really good at, you know, seeing the opportunities, assessing a bunch of information quickly, making very quick decisions, which serves us well when we are talking about tasks and situations, you know, in terms of like the construction project itself. But it really gets in the way when it comes to the human being and the relationship issues that are happening. And quite often we want to approach those human interactions the same way we approach the task interactions, right? We want to be quick about it, and we think we have the answer. We've been here. We've done this before. We were raised in a certain way, so you should just have to deal with it. And I always say, you know, when we know better, we do better. And I think we know that human beings want to feel connected. We know that they want to feel like they belong somewhere. When we approach them with this mentality of just do what I've done and I've got the answer, it disconnects them. So they no longer care, because you've demonstrated as a construction owner or a leader that you don't care, right? That's how it comes across. It might not be your intention, but that way of approaching the problem is the impact. The impact you have is you've just driven disconnection. So when we take that time, just to finish this thought, when we take that time to kind of, okay, what's really going on for you? What are you trying to achieve by taking 3 months off? How are we going to do this? When you take time to get into other people's interiors, yes, it takes time. I'm not going to dispute that. It isn't quick, but you have to slow down to understand that and gather the information you need to build a plan to go forward. And I think that's the skill set that new leaders in this new kind of, changing landscape, when they can embrace and build that skill set of really slowing down, understanding where people are coming from, they unlock the opportunities that are there. And I think that's when we'll start to attract people back into our industry.
So I'd like to push back against that a little bit.
Yeah.
So there's a freeway being built. Not a freeway. The freeway is already built, but they're redoing it. And it's right by my house. Yeah. They're spending months, years doing it. They're working nights. Mm-hmm. And when I drive by that, for instance, I just see a bunch of dudes out there doing their thing. And it seems to me that there's a certain reality to construction around things like schedules, the actual physical work itself, because there is physical work involved. I understand where you're coming from in terms of the changes in culture that have occurred over the years, and how construction doesn't seem to fit into that. It doesn't naturally fit into that. There's a tremendous amount of change that needs to take place. And yet, the way some construction companies would look at it is, I'm just going to keep working on finding the people who actually fit in with my culture, as opposed to trying to adapt my culture to everybody else. Because isn't this my business, and I get to do it the way that I want to do it within, obviously, legal realms and all that kind of stuff. But isn't that with all the responsibilities I have as a entrepreneur, do I not have some privileges to run the business the way I want to run it?
Yeah. And I think, what I'm seeing in the clients that I work with, I definitely, absolutely, it's the business owner's right. Where I think it's a bit short-sighted is when we then start having the conversation around, why can't I find people, and why aren't people joining me? Or if they join me, why don't they stay? And I think that's the piece where it's like, okay, if it's working for you and you've got a robust workforce and you've got, you can deliver your projects and things are going great, sure, don't change it. Clearly you're doing something right and you're attracting people that see and fit with your vision. Where I find it interesting is, all of these conversations that I'm hearing in the space in our industry right now that are like, we can't find people, we can't get them to stay, we can't, they come, they stay for 6 months and then they're gone. So it's like, okay, if people aren't staying, that's when we need to look at what we're doing and going, what are we doing that isn't meeting the needs of the people?
And I'm just going to be perfectly blunt here. It's like, if I'm running a construction company and I'm hiring a dude who's going to take 3 months off when he has a kid, my first thought is, I don't want to hire that guy. I just don't want to hire him. I don't want a project manager taking 3 months off, because my project ain't taking 3 months off. And the talent pool isn't massive anyway. So I'd rather wait and hire someone who ain't going to take 3 months off, or maybe a week, maybe 2, maybe even a month, maybe, but 3 months. Dude, and if that's in the middle of the summer when we're supposed to be building, that has a massive impact on my company.
Yeah. So I took 3 years off to have 3 kids, because in Canada we get a year-long maternity leave, right? And so
I'm just for the record here, I am making a distinction between maternity leave and paternity leave. I'm making that distinction. Yeah.
Well, but I'll just and I dealt with this as well, like as a leader in the last part of my career. So in Canada, the first 13 weeks are for the mother, but the other 37 weeks are for either parent.
Sure.
So in Canada, you could actually have a guy that takes 37 weeks off of work, which is the better part of a year. And you're right. You've got to deal with these things. And what I know is when we've invested in these people and we've developed them and we've built their skills, in the grand scheme of their career, right? Like these 3 years I took off over the 25 years I was in construction were like this big. They were this big in my
No,
career,
in your
right?
career, yes. And I'm, but I'm not as a construction company owner, and I'm not necessarily thinking about that because I don't have a contract with you where I know you're going to be with me for 25 years and you're going to develop your career and you're an awesome performer. So therefore, I don't really care if it's 3 years, out of 25. I'll work around that. That's just not the reality I'm in.
Right. And I think that's exactly the problem is we're not thinking long enough term, right? We're thinking very short term. We're not thinking about how do we develop and retain and keep this talent? Because again, 3 months, 2 weeks, 37 weeks, whatever the time frame is, people have lives. People get sick, people have kids, people have aging parents, people have, mental health issues, people have all kinds of stuff going on inside their lives that they might need a little bit of support through. And what I know from my own personal experience and leading folks through this, when as an employer, we demonstrate we care, we offer the support we can, and sometimes it might be, there's not much I can do here and you need to take a leave of absence and we need to fill your position, or, like that is a tough conversation, but we've taken the time to understand it first before we've made the decision. When we demonstrate that level of care, through the empathy skills, we actually build connections. And I personally have returned to companies that have demonstrated those things to me. I've gone back when things were better and life was conducive to being back in that industry, in that company. And I've had people return to work for me after taking time or, parting ways for whatever they needed to part ways for. So I think that's why the conversation is important is we're losing people that are incredibly skilled, that we have worked hard to develop, and we want to keep them in the industry in whatever way that looks like.
Okay. And again, that's, you made a general statement there. We want to keep them in the industry, but don't I want to keep them in my company? And again, going back to because really that's, I'm all for people being in the construction industry, but if I'm a construction company owner, dude, I want the best people working for me. I don't care who they are or where they come from. I want them working for me.
Absolutely. And I think that's where I would challenge, these, the owners that have the mindset of like, I can't give someone 3 months off, because again, you're looking at 3 months off versus the entire contribution that skilled worker could bring to your company over the duration of them being there.
No, I understand that.
Right.
Mm-hmm. In your career, you've been called, as you were in the construction company, in the construction industry, working in it, you were called too emotional.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, as a female, I can tend to, when feeling overwhelmed, angry, upset, frustrated, my kind of go-to way that I express that is I cry. And so you can imagine how tears might have been received on a construction site. So it's not far-fetched to believe that I was called emotional. What I've found interesting and what I've come to understand is, in a very general sense, the masculine expression of emotion and the female expression of emotion, or the feminine expression of emotion, is very different, but we all express emotion. I've had superintendents and construction leaders that have thrown chairs across the room and put hammers through the wall, which was on a construction site perfectly acceptable way to express emotion. Right. And so for the first few years, I was like, okay, I'm emotional. Like, look at you guys, like what, how is this, this is a real double standard. And in those early years, I did spend a lot of time trying to figure out how can I express emotion in a way that is acceptable on a construction site. And the reality of it is it was exhausting trying to change this aspect of myself, which in reality never actually had to be changed. We just we had to build an understanding of like, I might shed a tear, you might throw a hammer, but it just means we're both frustrated.
Hey, it's Eric. I'm enjoying this conversation with Erin, aren't you? It's pretty awesome. This is something else that's pretty awesome. It's my book. Oh, man. I love doing these little promos in the middle of the show. You have to buy the book. Listen, let me tell you what you should do. Get a copy of this for you and every single leader in your construction company. Then this is what you do. There's 12 chapters in the book. So you read 4 chapters a month over 3 months. I promise you, the style of the book is very easy to digest for everyone. We're not talking about War and Peace here. We're not talking about Dostoevsky. We're not talking about any of that. We're just talking about simple, straightforward, no BS, leadership, sales, and marketing advice with some strategic thinking thrown in there as well. Get the book for you and your leaders. Read it together. And I'll tell you what, if you purchase 10 or more copies of the book and just shoot me an email at eric@constructiongenius.com, I will personally do a 30 to 60-minute Zoom session with you and your leadership team, answering any questions that you have about the book, and then giving you some bonus training as well. So reach out to me, eric@constructiongenius.com, if you buy 10 or more copies of the book and you want me to come and spend some time with your leadership team. And now back to my conversation with Erin. Oh, by the way, get the book on Amazon or wherever you get your books. All right, let's get back to the conversation. So I think it's interesting because I was reading The Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe. It was a pretty cool book in many ways. And one of the lines that just stuck with me was one of the characters, and he was behaving like a total knucklehead, but then, his wife started crying. And, there was a line in there about how no man can resist the tears of a woman, like they're paralyzed when a woman starts crying. And so I think some of the discomfort that men experience, and it goes both ways, right? Because a woman's feeling very uncomfortable when a man starts throwing a hammer through, a wall, or begins to behave in an aggressive male manner, which other men may be comfortable with or at least understand. And so it goes both ways.
It goes both ways. And that's what I learned to realize is like, it's just all of our collective discomfort with displays of emotion. Right. Yes. And so part of it is, as leaders, building our capacity to hold other people's emotions. Somebody might cry in your office. Somebody might get up and throw a chair. How do you build the capacity to sit in the discomfort and allow them to express their emotion? And then, okay, so you're feeling frustrated. What's that all about?
Let's and
stay in the conversation.
So let's talk about that specifically. How do I build the capacity to sit in that emotional display and rightly interpret it as a leader? Talk about that.
Yeah. So the first step and the first action that leaders need to take is actually feeling their own feelings. And a lot of us, especially as leaders, there is this, again, a more traditional accepted view that as leaders, we cannot show weakness. So we cannot feel anything, right? And we're supposed to be just like always present, always showing up, always have our stuff together. And it's not the reality, because we're human beings and we have emotions for a reason. Emotions are just simply information. They tell us when we're doing things that are aligned with the way we want to live. They tell us that we're doing things that are not aligned with the way we want to live. There's simply information. And the very first step that everybody who wants to lead another human being needs to understand is that they have to be comfortable with their own emotions. So you have to be willing to say, that meeting really pissed me off, or I'm really feeling frustrated, or, I'm super let down by that trade, or, I feel very taken advantage of because of this negotiation. Like, you have to give it words, and you have to be able to sit.
Now, are you talking about internally give it words or externally to others, or are you talking about both?
I think it's both. It starts internally, where you just simply acknowledge it, because for most of us, this is what we do. We feel something and we go, oh gosh, I'm getting angry, I'm getting upset. And we shove it down and we go, don't feel it, push through, And what happens is it's just like pushing that. It's like putting it in a little pressure cooker, and you just keep shoving emotions in this pressure cooker, when all of a sudden you're sitting in a meeting and one guy looks at you sideways or asks a really, maybe not so intelligent question, and you'll lose your marbles in the middle of the meeting. You come unglued and nobody can figure out why. Right. And it's because you haven't done your own inner work. You haven't. So I can't sit with somebody else and even think about holding on to their emotion if my emotional bucket is like under pressure and full. Mm-hmm. Right. So it starts with the inner work, and then it just starts with Little bits at a time, Eric, sitting with people and allowing them to feel their emotions. There is no magic to this. It's like, I can see that you're upset. Do you want to talk about it? And it starts with those little conversations over time. And eventually we get better and better. It's like one push up a day, you know, eventually you can do 10 and then you can do 25. And then we build the capacity to hold bigger and bigger conversations, more emotional conversations.
Okay, so then I understand where you're coming from. I think that the logic works very well in a situation where you know you have long-term relationships with someone, and perhaps the word that came into my mind is in domestic situations. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm having a conversation with one of my kids, and you know, they're going to be around for a while. I'm going to be around for a while.
That's right.
And so I'm willing for the incremental progress. But I'm a project executive having a conversation with my project manager. And though I may be willing for the long-term relationship, I still have a concrete pour at 5:30 in the morning tomorrow. And if you're not on the job site managing that concrete pour, then something has to happen. So there's the immediacy of the work at hand, which still needs to be dealt with as I'm building this empathy muscle that you're talking about. How do I manage that dynamic?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love what you said about the domestic piece, because I think we can do a lot of practice there in our personal relationships. And that's where we can build some of this. Like, I always call our personal relationships kind of like going to the gym, you know, and then the race, so to speak, or the performance is when we're at work, right? So I can do a lot of work in terms of my own emotional management, understanding and reading other people in my personal life, so that when I get in front of that project manager, to use the example that you've laid out, you know, I can look at that and go, what am I feeling about this? Well, I'm feeling like there's some urgency. There's some, you know, I'm anxious. I'm a little bit frustrated that maybe this isn't happening in the way it is. And I can go, what's going on with you? So I don't react from this place of being frustrated. I can respond and get curious about it. Because here's the thing. In the human brain, when someone is having an emotional reaction, they actually can't access their logic and reason. There is like an order of operations in our brain. And if we are feeling a big emotion, doesn't matter what it is, joy, ecstasy, you can be the happy ones or the, you know, the not so happy ones. But when we are feeling big things, we do not have access to the logic and reasoning. It's kind of like bringing a calculator to a knife fight. Okay. When you bring, you know, and people say this all the time, just calm down. Like, think about this logically. The brain physically can't do that. So you have to have the emotional conversation first and then get into the problem solving mode. And that's where we need to, that's why we need to build this skill, is because we have to be able to deal with the emotion. Otherwise, people just get frustrated and throw things and break things and, you know, and then they leave. And that's why so many of these conversations in construction blow up into these bigger things than they need to be, because we haven't taken time to deal with the emotional part of the human being sitting across the table from us.
Okay, so let me back it up a little bit. So we've been sort of in the realm of crisis in our conversation here. How can a leader become a fire preventer as opposed to a firefighter when it comes to managing, leading their teams and helping people to manage their emotions so that we can access more of the logic and reason which is needed in order to build a project profitably?
And I love this question. To me, this is about that proactive check-in where you're actually having a meaningful conversation with your team members. And it's not just like, is everything okay? Because most of us will say, yep, we got it under control. And there might be a totally different thing going on, right? It's some good questions like, you know, where are you feeling overwhelmed, right? Where are you feeling stuck? How can I support you in meeting your project goals? what's top of mind this week for you? You know, what are your priorities? It's those proactive.
How often am I having this conversation?
It's going to depend, you know. I think new people on the team where you're just building a relationship need to have it more often, because this is part of that foundational kind of relationship building blocks, if you will. So you're probably having that conversation once every week or 2 weeks. But with somebody that you've got
Okay.
an established relationship, this might be like a monthly check-in, you know?
Right.
If
Right.
they've been with you for a while and there is this level of comfort that if something does pop up or go sideways, or they start to feel a little bit overwhelmed, they're going to come to you anyway. Like, you've got to gauge it with the team, but it's not like every day. It's not a super time consuming thing.
So give me your top 3 questions that you found to be most effective as a leader to tapping into some of this being emotionally intelligent yourself, but then also helping you to helping the people that you lead to understand and process their own emotions, so that those things are not having a negative impact on their performance.
Great question. I think I would start with, I always like to get people thinking about what's going well, because our human brain likes to focus on the negative
That's
quite a lot.
correct.
So I like to start with, you know, what's going really well right now for you. So maybe that's this week or this month, but what's going really well. I think another good one is like, where are you feeling challenged? You know, and that can bring up a whole bunch of different things. Unless it's a teenager, you know, these teenagers are the only demographic that I found that can answer an open-ended question with one word.
Yes.
Still.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is very interesting. So yeah, you know, what's going well? Where are you feeling challenged? And then I always like to say, like, what do you need from me to support you in achieving your goals? You know, and sometimes it's like, not much. This conversation's been great. Or sometimes it's like, you know what I could really use is X, Y, Z. And then it's up to me as a leader to figure out, can I do that? You know, is that an option for me? But at least you're asking them to start to think about some of these things.
How do you practice active listening in these types of conversations?
For me, the skill that I always go back to is just, when somebody is done sharing, I will repeat back to them what I've heard in my own words. And it's enough of a pause. What that does is it forces me to not respond right away, but to really make sure that I've actually understood what they're saying. So I'll say something like, if I heard you right, you know, this was your concern, this is your challenge, this is what you think is going well today, and here's what you've asked me for in terms of support. And they might be like, yeah, actually. And that simple act really helps the people feel heard and understood.
Okay, so how do I manage then my inner dialogue that's occurring as the other person is talking? So what I mean by active listening, I understand that what you just said there, I think it's a great one, but that seems to be like after the person has finished talking. I'm talking about, I ask the question like, where are you feeling challenged? And the person begins to speak, and then my mind goes over here. How do I stay in that space of active listening so that I can fully hear what that person is saying to me?
Probably what happens before the piece I just shared around, you know, repeating back, is I take notes. I literally write it down as they're speaking. You know, I'm like, okay, they said this, they said that, because it engages that part of my brain. And if anything comes up in terms of a question I have, or an area that I want to explore, I'll just make a little note in my notebook that we can come back to after I've confirmed understanding.
So then the act of taking notes helps you to stay focused. So do you tell, let's say it's an in-person conversation. Are you going to tell the person, hey, listen, I'm going to be taking notes, and the reason why it helps me to fully hear what you're saying?
I say it all the time. Yeah. And even, you know, like in meetings like this online, people will be like, why are you looking down, Erin? I'm like, oh, it's because I'm like, I got my notebook, you know, I'm taking some notes here because it helps me to really stay in the conversation.
Yeah. I found that to be very powerful myself when because I'm in coaching conversations all the time. And that's what we're talking about here. I think it's interesting that as a leader, a construction leader, there are times when you're functioning in an executive manner, where you're giving direction and you're receiving reports of what people have said. But there's also times when you're functioning as a coach.
Yes.
What do you think are the keys to being an effective coach as a leader?
I think there's a few things to be an effective coach. One, you have to spend some time observing what's really happening. You have to watch the team. You have to pay attention to how people are behaving. And what are you seeing in terms of the actual behaviors? What are people saying? What are they doing? And then you need to get curious, right? And so you ask way more questions than you dole out advice.
How do I do the asking of the questions without being manipulative or coming across to others like I'm being manipulative?
Yeah, I think so. The differentiator there for me is, and we're getting pretty nuanced here, but I feel like when people are new to the goal or the task, or new to the thing that you're asking them to do, and you start asking a lot of questions, that's when it can feel manipulative, because they're like, listen, I'm new. I actually don't know anything. Why are you asking me all these questions? And that's where they probably need a little more direction than questions. I feel like where the questions are really warranted are when people are simply lacking confidence or motivation, but we know they know how to do things, And so that's when we can get into, like, what would you do? How have you solved this problem in the past? And really get them to see that actually they have the answers, and that they don't need to keep coming to you. Not in all instances, but for the most part, like, they're skilled, they're competent, they know what to do, but maybe they're lacking some competence or some confidence. And I think that's where the questions can really help and feel supportive versus feeling manipulative.
Okay, so we began our conversation with this idea of empathy, and you gave us that definition of empathy as the ability to understand and accept emotions. Mm-hmm. As we're wrapping up the conversation, I'm just want to take just a hook back into that. When is empathy inappropriate?
It's certainly not an exhaustive list, but in my experience, the only time I think it warrants not really understanding what's going on for people emotionally is really in those life and death emergency situations. And I go back to, like, if I've got a gas line that's just been hit on a construction site, I really don't, my priority is keeping people safe, not how are you feeling, right? And I'm going to go to command and control, and I'm going to evacuate that site in the best way I know possible. That is about, in our modern day world, for the majority of us at work, that is about the only situation where there is, like, life and death on the line, where we don't need to lean into this skill of really understanding what's going on for someone else.
So that's interesting that you say that the only situation where empathy is not appropriate is in a life and death situation. Okay, so what if I have an employee who for the last 6 months has been not performing and not showing up, and maybe I've gone through the, hey, how you doing? What's up at home? All this kind of stuff. And there comes a time where I'm going to take some command and control and say, you are no longer working here. So that's not an emergency situation, but I guess what I am asking is firing someone an act of empathy, or disciplining them, giving them a performance improvement, whatever it is, write up.
I think it can be, and it's about what comes before that. And you hit the nail on the head when you said, assuming I've done all of the conversations, assuming that I've explored what's going on for them, and I've restated the expectation, and I've taken time to understand, and I worked with them to find solutions to get them back on track. If you've done all of that work, I absolutely think performance management, performance plans, even terminating somebody can be an act of empathy, because it could be the thing that they need to, like, get started in the next area of their life, because clearly they're not on the right seat in their, bus of life, if you will. They really do need, and people here, as humans, we like to stay safe. And so even if we're not performing and it's slightly uncomfortable, it's the devil we know. And it's safer, it feels safer to us than leaving and starting something new. And so sometimes as leaders, we have to be the people that give the person the kick out of the nest,
right,
if you will.
Okay.
But it can be an act of empathy if you do it with all of that stuff before.
Okay. So I'm going to ask one last question. It's a two-part question. And I'd like you to give some short advice to women entering the construction industry about how they should conduct themselves. And then I'd like you to give some short advice to men in the construction industry as they're working with women. You can structure that any way that you like, but something really, really punchy and memorable that a woman in the business can understand and a man in the business can understand as it relates to men and women working together in construction.
So I think for the women in construction, I think my advice would be that the first piece is that you're not broken. There's nothing wrong with you if you think, act, or express emotion differently. There's nothing wrong with you, and there's nothing that needs to be fixed, right? And so just, stop wasting your energy trying to change who you are and just show up, right? Just be there for part of the conversation. And I think the advice for the men is very similar. It's like, stop trying to fix people that don't look and act and think like you. For both sides, we have to get curious. Why do you think that way? What we have different ways of approaching problems because we have a different perspective. And if we can, that's the piece we have to start to leverage.
We're 50 minutes in. I think we could, this is one of those conversations where we could go a lot longer. So I think what I'm going to do, Erin, is I'm probably going to invite you to come back on the show at some point. Because I'd like,
sure, that would be
what
great.
I'd like to explore a little further is this idea of you're not broken and stop trying to fix people. And the reason why I want to explore that is because my immediate thought to that is, hold on a minute. I know that there's always areas that I can improve in. And there's times when it's inappropriate for me to behave in certain ways and I need to change that. And as a leader, I'm not necessarily trying to fix other people because that's not necessarily my job, but I am trying to give them opportunities to develop and point out areas where they are performing and where they're not performing. And so there's a lot of subtlety and nuance in this conversation here.
There is, and it would be a wonderful conversation to dive into.
Erin, tell us a little bit more about yourself, how people can get in hold of you and all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, excellent. So they can find me and connect with me on LinkedIn, or for those of the folks that listen and are on Instagram, I am there as well. My website is www.erinthorp.ca, and Thorp is no E, so THORP. And I assume we'll have some links in the show notes.
There will be plenty of links. And you have a book called Inside Out Empathy?
I do have a book called Inside Out Empathy. They can find that on Amazon or anywhere books are, any book retailer.
Excellent. All links in show notes. Please give Erin a look on LinkedIn or her website, or check out her book. Erin, very interesting conversation here today. I think it would be very valuable to continue it. And I appreciate you taking the time to be on Construction Genius.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity, Eric. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to my conversation here today with Erin. As I was saying in the introduction, we will be coming back to Erin. And what we're going to be talking about in that conversation, by the way, is what she shared right at the end about you're not broken and stop trying to fix people. That dynamic, because it's a subtle dynamic, and we're going to be diving more into that. So in the meantime, feel free to reach out to Erin on her website, on LinkedIn. Check out her book, Inside Out Empathy. There's links in the show notes. Share this conversation with other people. I think it's a very important conversation because we are talking about how to interact with a variety of different people, different cultures, different backgrounds, men and women in construction, all this kind of great stuff. And so we really need to continue this conversation, continue to think about it, continue to reflect upon how we can improve as leaders. It's all good stuff. So thanks for listening to Construction Genius. Have a great day.